Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. This is just an outstanding turnout for people who are greeting each other with elbow bumps. You see that we're going to be talking. I'm going to introduce Larry in just a moment. He's going to be talking about Versailles. But as you know, I'm a medieval musicologist, and we happen to have here my eminent colleague, Daisy Delogu, who is also a medievalist in French literature. And she and I have put our heads together, and we want to tell you that people were writing about the plague long before now. Guillaume de Machaut, the great poet and composer of the 14th century, wrote about, in fact, his account of the plague in a poem called the Jugement de Navarre, written in the middle of the 14th century, is one of the only records we have about the spread of the plague at that time. And he tells us that, people were just dropping right and left, and so he ran into his house, locked the door, and did not come out until spring. And in a way, it's interesting because we hear that the virus may get better in the warmer weather. It's amazing how accurate these ancient accounts are. And Daisy reminded me, or told me, that the Journal d'un Bourgeois de Paris at the beginning of the 15th century tells us that 50,000 people in Paris died of the next iteration of the plague at that point. So I don't mean to sound morose or anything, but I just want us all to realize that this is something that we've known about for a long time, and that somehow humanity survives, and I'm delighted you're here today. So thank you so much. All right. I'm Ann Robertson. I'm Dean of the Humanities Division at the University of Chicago, and it's a great pleasure and honor to be here with you. And I'm so thrilled, again, that you've decided to join us tonight. I know how excited you are to hear Larry speak, and I'm telling you, he is just dynamite as a lecturer, as you'll see. So I'll keep my remarks brief. I have the honor of introducing him as our presenter, but before I do so, let me just give you a quick overview of what to expect and what's in store for us tonight. Larry Norman will give a brief presentation about the Palais de Versailles at three critical moments in history. When it was built by Louis XIV, secondly, during the French Revolution, and thirdly, its significance today. And he tells me we will get to see the fountains, so. Following the presentation, we'll open the floor for your questions, which I know Larry's eager to respond to. And then you'll have the opportunity to gather for dessert and to talk to Larry at even greater length. So without further ado, let me introduce my wonderful colleague, Larry Norman. Larry has been on the faculty of the University of Chicago since 1995, and he's currently the Frank L. Sulzberger Distinguished Service Professor in the departments of Romance Languages and Literatures, Theater and Performance Studies, Fundamentals, and in the college. So he is everywhere in the university. Larry is simply an extraordinary scholar. He's the author of two books. The first book, called The Shock of the Ancient, Literature and History in Early Modern France, which was awarded the Scaglione Prize for French and Francophone Literary Studies by the Modern Language Association when it was published in 2011. And his earlier book, right, The Public Mirror, Molière, and The Social Commerce of Depiction, both published by the University of Chicago Press. And he has edited or co-edited 5 volumes treating different aspects of early modern French culture, history, and literature. His work is driven by a concern with the dynamic interaction between texts and their aesthetic and historical framework. More specifically, he's interested in how individual works play in surprising ways with the social norms and literary expectations. So in today's talk, Larry will tell us how Louis XIV's Palace of Versailles helped shape European culture and history from the Baroque era through the French Revolution, and how it continues to animate contemporary international culture. A question he will discuss is how the palace, an astounding assemblage of architecture, visual arts, landscaping, performance spaces, and political arenas, reveals transformations in cultural tastes and power arrangements over the centuries. I'm delighted Larry's here with us tonight and very excited for his talk. Please join me in welcoming Larry Norman.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne, for that much too kind introduction. I'm so happy to be here this evening. I have a mic here, so I think I'll avoid this one. And thank you for the introduction to the talk, which I realize is much too big, like the Palace of Versailles itself, to handle in a 30-minute conversation with you, followed by questions. But I will try to cover some of these key issues, and in particular, the relationship between power and art at Versailles, the way in which art designed for a propaganda, image-building function can both praise and critique, can interrogate at the same time that it fills a function, a political function of the period. I have to start by saying I kind of hate Versailles. And I spent a lot of time at Versailles, and I've grown increasingly interested in it to the point that I want to thank you as supporters of the humanities. I've been able to do some interesting things with students in the last couple of years. I created a signature humanities course, which is open to students from all over the campus to think about Versailles through the centuries as a site of power and contestation. And I've just recently, in the process of completing an interdisciplinary seminar with a great art historian at the university, Richard Neer, which looks at visual arts and literature in the 17th century in France, which culminates in a trip to Paris, which we are probably not taking next week. Where we are busy, rescheduling. We found a date in June, so all's well. So I was about to take students with Richard to explore all of these questions. So that's the framework. The relationship between power and art. And so I start here inside the palace. We're going to be spending more time in the gardens, you'll see, but also inside the palace with Louis XIV. This is from the 17th century, very typical representation here. You may notice he's not wearing typical 17th century garb. He's dressed as a Roman emperor. Next to him, it's kind of hard to make out, you have two Roman busts surrounded by marble, the decor of the period. You may notice there's one element that's not so Greco-Roman. That's Louis XIV's 17th century powdered wig, right? Which he was always represented with that wig, sort of a bit anachronistic. But here, what are these strange fellows doing? Those are two pop art sculptures by Takashi Murakami. And every year, Versailles turns over the palace to a contemporary artist. And that's where we'll end tonight. And I'm going to try to rush through so we can get from the 17th century to the 21st century in record time, I hope. Let's just start with a few words about Louis himself. I'll move in. And Versailles. In the centerpiece of the Hall of Mirrors, the painted ceilings by Lebrun, Charles Lebrun. And I learned, by the way, from a French guide at the Louvre that the way to make students remember Charles Lebrun's name is to call him Charlie Brown, which very easy to do. And Charles Lebrun, and you see this is representing the moment in 1661, painted 20 years later for the Hall of Mirrors, in which Louis took personal power and refused at the age of 23 to name a prime minister, but to rule by himself. And that is the insignia for this. And you'll notice, although this represents a moment of contemporary history, Once again, although he still has his wig on, it's Roman armor, and then the Greco-Roman gods in which he's surrounded by. Here we have Minerva representing wisdom and also empire. Here we have glory descending to crown him, various Olympian gods all around, muses and so on. That use of the classical tradition as both an element of artistic beauty, but also of prestige, of power and empire, will run throughout everything that we see from the 17th century. So it's a modernization of a Greco-Roman tradition toward political aims, but also at times a very playful, even subversive use of it. Why, very quickly, why did Louis go to Versailles? It was a hunting lodge of his father, Louis XIII. But during Louis's youth, there were civil wars in France contesting the monarchy, just as there were in France. Just as there were in England, in the English civil wars. In the case of France, the monarchy won in a strong way, but Louis kept a great deal of fear regarding uprisings, and he associated Paris with popular uprisings. And therefore, he sought to establish a capital outside of Paris. Paris had been, the Louvre was the capital of Paris for centuries, and in 1682, around the time that this painting is being done, Louis named Versailles the official capital of France, which it remained, so outside of Paris, until the French Revolution. So enough of the political context. Let's look at Versailles itself. I want to start with the famous French gardens of Versailles. The angle here in the gardens going up the Grand Allée. We're going to visit a couple of objects in between as we go through. You have the Fountain of Apollo. More on Apollo shortly. But I just want to think about the French garden itself. André Lenotre, the great landscape designer, creator of the French garden. Here we see the garden design. The French garden noted for its geometricization of space, the way in which nature is formed into grid-like patterns with strong perspective, very rectilinear, and yet always played with by the vegetation, by surprising curves. So in itself, it's sort of a mix of this hyper-rationalism of the age of Descartes, a mastery over nature, a domination of nature. None of this has anything to do, well, we've skipped ahead, with the reality of the landscape at the time. Everything was destroyed. Every tree was knocked down in order to create this massive tyranny over nature. And there I use the term that the Duc de Saint-Simon, a contemporary of Louis XIV, used to describe Versailles, that it was a way of tyrannizing nature the way the absolute monarchy tyrannized France, according to Saint-Simon. Having said that, now I want to take a look at a few images to give a sense of the vivacity, the breadth of imagination that was present at the moment of the inauguration of the new Versailles, transformed from hunting lodge of his father, Louis XIII, to royal palace in 1664. And in order to celebrate this transformation, a 7-day series of festivities was created called The Pleasures of the Enchanted Island. And it was inspired, all of these festivities, by the Renaissance romance of Ariosto, Orlando Furioso. Lots of magic, many different parades, sumptuous feasts outside, new works of art, but also a lot of theater. Here's a typical kind of procession during the days, during this period of festivities. You have Louis XIV here playing the role of Roger. It doesn't sound like a great paladin, does it? Ruggiero, I think, would be better. Roger, Roger, the knight, and he was the sort of the chief hero throughout the festivities. In the background, Apollo on a chariot surrounded by the four ages, and this includes pageantry, a long discourse about how Louis XIV has brought back the golden age. But chiefly, it was also a theatrical festival, a festival of plays, all written by Molière. And you see the way in which these plays were set inside the gardens using the perspective. This is a hedge set design. And in the back, you actually see the Palace of Versailles with the perspective. And here, Molière's troupe performing. Other plays were performed in the courtyard of the palace. This is the Cour Marley, which is still you can visit. This is where you enter into the palace today. Here, an opera, but this was actually the space in 1664 in which Molière performed Tartuffe. So I just want to stop there for a second. You may have seen Tartuffe. You probably don't think about it primarily as a panegyric of absolute monarchy. It's a satire of religious hypocrisy. But it actually fit the king's desire. He was a young king. He was extremely promiscuous. He was tired of being bothered by the church. So in a sense, this satire of religious hypocrisy fit the king's design. And yet at the same time, Molière's satire goes considerably further than anything that can be contained in sort of a royal panegyric, and can take aim itself at forms of authority, including monarchical authority. So I want to get a sense right away that with this example, and we'll be talking more about works of art than theater, of the way in which those works which were commissioned as part of a royal image making can come back and, in a sense, turn on their commissioner, turn on their patron, and offer forms sometimes of subtle and sometimes of a very strong critique of power. I'm going to skip the fireworks. They're just such beautiful images, amazing. The use of illumination, but for water. And I want to turn now and think about fountains at Versailles. This was the most important element of the garden design, and I'll talk a little bit about the logistics behind this. But here we see a beautiful structure considered at the time really to be the chief beauty of Versailles in the early years, which was then knocked down 30 years later for the expansion of the palace. And it's the Grotto of Thetis. Thetis is a sea nymph. She's the mother of Achilles. But the idea is that the Apollo, the sun, after its day's movement across the skies in its chariot, came to Thetis for a lovely evening and night of enjoyment. And so it was the resting place of Apollo. Now, as you know, Louis XIV fashioned himself as the Sun King. And Apollo was his, in a sense, emblem. It was his patron god. When one saw Apollo at Versailles, one thought of Louis XIV. So in a sense, this is reaffirming that centrality of the king. Here he is in front of the grotto, which was filled with fascinating waterworks. And in the interior, there was actually water trailing down all of these coral. I mean, it must have been stunningly beautiful coral movements, the ponds themselves. There were also fountains around each of these figures. And again, we have centrally Apollo. Once again, Apollo served by the nymphs as he returns in the evening at sunset to take rest with Thetis. This imagination, and I'll give you this actual work, is the masterpiece of Girardon, who was the greatest sculptor of the French 17th century. You can see it today at Versailles. Again, that use of classical antiquity, but a power that seeks to assert itself through soft power, through culture, through the use of images of beauty, rest, and classical harmony. And here I want to get a sense, I'm going to go very quickly through a series of paintings by Jean Cautel, which were produced to show the gardens of Versailles as the playground of the gods of antiquity and of mythical figures. Always with, you'll see, the fountains everywhere, that water moving everywhere. This one represents a Psyche, of Cupid and Psyche, preparing herself to meet Cupid. Here we have, for example, the Judgment of Paris, with the three beauties here, with the fountains of Versailles behind it. This is the Apotheosis of Venus. And I want to stress these very playful, beautiful images that seem to be, in a way, pure art, in a sense, were in fact works of propaganda as well. This is an engraving book that was published at the time with all of those images that were sent to all the courts throughout Europe in order to show the power and prestige of Versailles. And as you may well know, Versailles then became the model to imitate throughout Europe, whether in Naples, whether with Sanssouci outside of Berlin and Potsdam, everywhere courts tried to emulate this style. Now, I want to now look at two works of art that are fountains to think about sort of their assertion of power, but the double-edged assertion of power, a little bit about what water and hydraulics are, and then a couple of more works of art. So the first fountain is the Fountain of Latona. Latona in Greek is Leto, and Latona was the mother of Apollo and Diana. This is in the central alleyway. There she is. You see her a little bit closer of Versailles, looking down the perspective from the Hall of Mirrors all the way in the background. You see the Apollo fountain. Here you see Latona. She actually has Apollo and Diana in her arms, and then a bunch of strange creatures. Shall we take a look at those? This is a rendering at the time. The fountain was actually, like everything in Versailles, redesigned 30 years later. So they took the figurines and stacked them in the pyramidal form that you see earlier. Here you see the water running in the fountain with these strange creatures. Here are some more of the creatures. And here you can get a good look at one of them. Kind of strange, isn't it? So what is the story? The story is that Latona, who was the mother of the children by Zeus, attracted the ire, the jealous ire of Hera and of Juno, and thus had to flee. She was chased by Hera Juno and couldn't find shelter. She landed in Lycia, and there she found a place to get some water. And the local natives said, no, you cannot drink from this fountain. They were afraid of Hera or Juno's wrath as well. Latona, raised her arms to Zeus and said, punish these people. And they were transformed into the frogs around the fountain where she was trying to drink. And this is a story that is recounted by Ovid in the Metamorphoses. So here you see all these figures. They're really wonderful to look at, this act of metamorphosis. Now, this can be read very simply as a political allegory. Apollo, all right, go against Apollo or his mother, and you're going to be turned into a frog. Right? A rather brutal image, right? And design. Yet we all know these stories of metamorphoses are quite a bit more nuanced, and I'll just suggest here one element of this. The author of this story, the most famous example and where everyone took to be the source, is Ovid. Ovid was a poet working under, and at times, supported by Augustus. Louis XIV called himself the new Augustus. This was the new Augustan age. It was going to be a flourishing of art, like that of Virgil, Ovid, and Horace. And yet we know that the relationship between those artists and Augustus was very troubled. And Ovid himself was, of course, sent into exile by Augustus because of the nature of his poetry. So that tense relationship between artist and patron, between a glorious age of literature which represents a kind of national power and empire, and yet a literature which at the same time undercuts the nature of that power or authority, is replicated here in the 17th century. Now, this one, second fountain sculpture that I want to look at is the Fountain of Enceladus. Now, this was just kind of interesting, so I just want to point out, it's kind of hard to get the proportions here. This is a person, so you get a sense of the size of this figure. There's the figure. There's the backside. I love the backside. Beautiful. So Enceladus was one of the titans, one of the giants, the generation, of course, with Cronus and so on, that preceded the gods. that ate the gods until Zeus himself managed to survive. The gods, the young generation of civilization, revolts against the Titans. The Titans are then defeated and thrown into the earth where they are captured, as though civilization has repressed barbarity under the earth. In the case of Enceladus, he was variously overcome by Zeus or by Apollo. And he is buried in Mount Etna, always ready to erupt. Barbarity, primal nature, always ready to overtake civilization. The civilized, polite monarchy of Louis XIV, always menaced by some revolt. The fact that this, in a sense, can be read also as a very simple allegory. Don't try to revolt against me, or you're going to find yourself buried in a mound of hot lava and boulders. This is what will happen to you. But then think again. Why, in the middle of this palace, would we see the outstretched arm of an angry rebel ready to throw that giant boulder, because this is a giant, at us, at the king, as though the repression itself becomes the object of art, and at the same time it acts as a symbol of the power destroying its enemies, but also of the persistence of the enemies always to revolt. I always kind of think that this, like the French Revolution, could have just bubbled out from this figure and pounced out of Versailles in that one figure. Now, I just want to think a little bit about what all this water is, because we've talked about it purely as art. But this is the biggest hydraulic engineering feat of the 17th century. And that is no small feat, because the 17th century was a great period of hydraulic engineering. Here you see Versailles in the late 17th century, the fountains running, the Grand Canal, which could accommodate ships and so on. Just to remind you of some of the hydraulic feats of the 17th century, these included the Grachtengordel in Amsterdam. These included the great fountains built throughout Rome in the 17th and 18th century, such as the Fountain of Four Rivers by Bernini. How did Versailles, on a high hill, manage to get all that water? Well, it required the great engineering work called the machine of Marley to take the water from the Seine River, and there you see Versailles up the top, up 400 feet, pumping 1 million gallons of water a day, more than was used in the entire city of Paris at the time in a day, to run those fountains, which even when they were running full time, could only run 1/4 at one time. It's just unbelievable. And it becomes a real point of pride for France. This is a real, shown throughout science books. This is from the encyclopedia in the 18th century. As the great feat. So I want to come back to that idea of a mastery of nature, domination of nature, the use of all technologies to further this. Technologies, again, mastering technologies are central. Here, the Hall of Mirrors, the most famous element of Versailles, but which was meant at the time to be above all a piece of propaganda for the French manufacturing of mirrors, which had been dominated by Venice, and which Louis XIV was intent on making France as the central motor of. And the Hall of Mirrors itself was not just a place of pleasure or abstract political domination. It was a place of real global political domination. And here in 1715, we see the old Louis XIV receiving the Persian ambassador. This ambassador from Siam had just arrived several years before as part of the colonial expansion of France in the 17th century. And remember, until the mid-18th century, it was on a fairly equal footing with England in terms of global domination. So you see, actually, just to make it clear, these are the mirror images in the back. We're in the Hall of Mirrors and the aged Louis XIV. I'm going to take one digression about disease. It was also a pit of disease. It was a horribly unhealthy environment, Versailles. Louis XIV was succeeded by his great-grandson because all of his children had died. The one grandson who survived had been placed upon the Spanish throne, the beginning of the Spanish Bourbons, and Louis XIV practically destroyed France through the wars in order to have the Bourbon dynasty implanted in Spain, right? And so all that was left was a great-grandson who was 7 years old at the time of his death. Now, I want to now look at two works of art that I think are the most interesting and in a sense push us to the edge of what can be represented at Versailles. These are two sculptures by Pierre Bouchet, one of the greatest sculptors in Europe in the 17th century. These were commissioned by there was no prime minister, by the Minister of Finance, Colbert, by Bouchet to be for Versailles. They were the two largest marble blocks that had been found in quite a while. They were given to Bouchet. The first subject we're going to look at can be seen in the Gardens of Versailles. That is now a plaster cast because the original is in the Louvre. And this is, Milo of Croton. So who is Milo of Croton? He was a hero. He was known as the great wrestler. He was a military hero. He was a great hunter. And this depicts Milo at his death. And how did he die? He was so strong that when he walked through the forest, he saw a natural rent in a tree, sort of splitting of the tree. And he said, I can split this tree in two. Mastery over nature, total domination. And what happens? As he's splitting the tree in two, the tree closes back on him like a bear trap, captures his hands and arms, renders him immobile, and he is then devoured by wolves or lions, in this version by lions. Nature taking revenge on the person who dominates, the hero struck down, destroyed by his own hubris. And yet, it was put right in the center of the Gardens of Versailles because that's the nature of art. The advantage, in a sense, in what I can praise Louis XIV for, in a very limited way, I do not like absolute monarchy, I don't even like constitutional monarchy, but is that he knew his reputation depended on the grandeur of the art. And he didn't probably want to think too much about the fact that great art also has this power to suggest meanings that one wouldn't want it to suggest. However, it can go too far. The other object, the other great sculpture by Pierre Bouchet in the Louvre today, now considered the masterpiece of French 17th century sculpture, is the story, this is the full picture, I'm going to do a close-up, of Alexander. I said that Louis liked to call himself the new Augustus. He also liked to call himself the new Alexander. So we can read in Alexander the Conqueror here, Louis XIV himself, and the cynic philosopher, Diogenes. Diogenes, a philosopher who rejected as vain all worldly goods, but also even the idea of wisdom. Diogenes, who lived in a tub that he carried with him. That's all he had. He had a tub and a spoon. That's all you need in life. That's philosophy. Alexander, I won't talk about it. Anyway, Alexander wanted to meet this great philosopher. So he comes up to him, and what does Diogenes say? It's very famous. He replies, when Alexander says, can you speak to me? He replies, what do you have to say? Diogenes says, get out of my sun. Move your shadow, is the literal translation. Move your shadow. You're just blocking my sun. I need a little warmth here. And this depiction of Alexander, there are different representations of this story. Alexander in some is very accommodating, like, oh, how philosophical, okay. This is not an Alexander who's kind of saying how philosophical. He looks ironic, he looks a little upset. This sculpture was brought to the Louvre by one of the great sculptors of the time, and it was put immediately in deep, dark storage, where it remained until the 19th century. and is now a masterpiece that you can see in the Louvre. So going too far. So now I'm going to quickly move to what it is to go too far and revolt, right? So this part I won't be able to talk much about, but the revolution, right? And it's important to remember the French Revolution. We all know the storming of the Bastille, but the real center of the politics was Versailles in those first few months. And most famously, when Louis XVI calls the Estates General to figure out what to do about a broke political system, and the clergy, the nobility, and the bourgeoisie decide to join hands, abandon their ancient privileges, and create a new constitution for France. All takes place in Versailles. They move famously to the Jeu de Paume, to the tennis court, make the famous oath of the tennis court, saying that they will not leave this room at Versailles until a constitution has been formed. And here we have that inspirational moment represented by David, the great neoclassical painter. But what I want to show you is a sketch by David of this painting, where you see the same figures that are in the painting of the famous statesman of the French Revolution, but depicted as Greek gods, as Greek statuary. That same recourse to Greek antiquity and the canons of classical art are applied now for a very different meaning. It is now not Alexander or Augustus who's being referred to. It's Pericles, it's democracy, it's Cato, it's the Roman Republic and Greek democracy rather than the monarchs of antiquity that are being used. Finally, for the French Revolution, we see some rather non-classical figures here, and it's just a reminder of what a women's march can do. After 3 months after the storming of Bastille, 2 months after the tennis court oath, the creation of a new constitution, the king was unbudgeable, would not cede. And the women of Paris, also driven by hunger, because there was no bread, marched from Paris to Versailles, a 3-hour march on foot, surrounded the palace, barged in, went past, killed several of the Swiss guard, and took Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette back to Paris, right? It's an incredible story, and I can say, teaching the text, we have the testimonies of the women at the time, and it's a fascinating subject for my students. Okay, now, back to my conclusion here with our lovely figures of Murakami. Versailles, of course, no longer represents the French monarchy, although Emmanuel Macron seems to have a few designs in that direction, as do all French presidents. There's always that prestige lended to Versailles. It's a very useful prop for any political leader, but it's a museum. It's a museum of French history. It's also a museum of art. And as such, it encourages free dialogue in a democracy and the role of art to critique and subvert. And so, some rather daring exhibitions. The first of the contemporary exhibitions created for Versailles was Jeff Koons. Hold on to your seats. There's Louis, the same Louis we've seen, same sculpture, the Roman busts. And here is the emperor of pop culture, Michael Jackson with bubbles. What do we think? I mean, it's actually a stunning idea, right? I'm not a big Jeff Koons fan, but to place this statue, right, which is an odd mix of pop art and classical art. He said he was inspired by Michelangelo's Pieta or other Pieta, right? It's the, yes, Bubbles is the baby and so on. But I would say, one of the definitions of kitsch is simply art that has lost its edge, art that is reproduced for commercial value. Jeff Koons practices a kind of artistic kitsch. But one could say the same thing about the art of the... Versailles is the largest piece of 17th century kitsch, right? Perhaps the largest piece of kitsch known to man. It's more than that, and we've begun to say individual objects, the plays, the texts, I can only begin to scratch the surface, are much more than that. But as an ensemble, it is a mass-produced object. This is the Portuguese artist Vincent Close. who has done here the heels of Marie Antoinette, made out of kitchen pots in the center of the Grand Gallery, the Hall of Mirrors. Oliver Eliasson, who's one of incredible artist and very interesting, here has done one of his water works. So we've seen how important water is, right? So now you're educated in everything water represents. It appears, but it was supposed to, it's supposed to be magical. We know there's pumps somewhere. We know there's a machine of Marley. But when we're walking around, we see these fabulous figures with water swirling around. And to capture that, he actually has water coming straight out of the sky. It's really a very ingenious idea. It's one that he executed a few years later under the Brooklyn Bridge. And I just want to quote here Eliasson, and then there'll be one last image. To give a sense, he described what he was doing at Versailles as a way of turning the art back to the individual experience, freed of authority, of the centrality of power within these gardens. So the other side of Versailles. He said, "The Versailles that I have been dreaming up is a place that empowers everyone. It invites visitors to take control of authorship of their experience instead of simply consuming and being dazzled by grandeur. It asks them to exercise their senses, to embrace the unexpected, to drift through the gardens, and to feel the landscape that takes shape through their movement." In a way, that seems like a direct attack, or let's say total contradistinction with the Versailles of Louis XIV, designed as an image-making central assertion of power. And yet, we know the way people experienced Versailles in the 17th century was a lot like that. They had individual experiences. It was a place of lovemaking. It was a place of festivity. It was a place that had many of these qualities. So, final artist are Anish Kapoor. Anish Kapoor, we all know Anish Kapoor from Skygate here in Chicago. Anish Kapoor, who is a Jewish Indian, Anglo-Indian of Jewish descent. And I mention this for a reason, as you'll see. Created 2015 this large installation in the central alley of Versailles. He called it Dirty Corner. And he suggested in certain ways that it resembled the orifice of the queen. So, we can think about, there are things that you may find upsetting about that and so on, but some people were upset in ways that are a little shocking. The large installation was vandalized by extreme right anti-Semitic hooligans, anti-Semitic motifs here throughout, Talmud, traitor Jews, the second rape of France. Kapoor was very upset about this. There was a cleaning of the objects. And then the Vandals struck again. The Vandals struck again, and Anish Kapoor accused Versailles of, in a sense, collaborating with the Vandals. And Versailles is an extremely conservative community. There is a side, even within the establishment of Versailles, that tends to be a bit monarchist. I'm not saying Kapoor is right. A lot of people think there's some truth to this, but it gives a sense of how these questions are still operating today. Kapoor, after the second vandalization, said that he didn't want it erased, and he wanted it to stay there, the vandalism, so France could know the dark side of itself, and should know the dark side of itself. A right-wing politician went to court to have it covered. He won. The right-wing politician won the court case, and it was covered. And if you know Versailles, you won't be surprised when I tell you it was covered with gold leaf, which is a strange thing to do to anti-Semitic graffiti. That brings us to today. And I'm not going to conclude. I think I've gone over a little bit, so I'm really looking for questions, but I hope I've given you a sense of the odd twists and turns, the relationship between power and subversion in a very powerful place like Versailles.